I arrived at the inn just before nightfall. The journey had been long, and my horse was tired. The place was old but well kept. Wooden beams darkened with age, paper lanterns casting a warm glow against the walls. A woman greeted me at the entrance. She was older, with a face like a faded ink painting. "You must be weary, sir," she said, bowing deeply. "A room is prepared." I nodded, stepping inside. The air smelled of cedar and tatami. It was a small establishment, the kind that served travelers like me, men who carried swords, men who had no home. She led me down a narrow hall. The floors creaked under our steps. At the end, she slid open a door. "This will be your room," she said, but did not move aside. Instead, she kept her hand on the doorframe, fingers pressed lightly against the wood. "There is one thing," she said after a pause. "Inside, you will see a tatami mat near the far wall. Do not step on it." Her voice was steady, but her eyes flickered. I waited for an explanation. None came. "Why?" I asked. She lowered her gaze. "It is an old rule of this house." I could have pressed further, but I was too tired. I only nodded. She stepped aside and I entered. The room was simple. A futon in the corner, a low table, a candle. The tatami was fresh and firm beneath my feet. I turned to close the door, and the woman was still there, watching. I did not ask again. I did not notice the mat at first. Only when I sat to remove my swords did I see it. A single tatami mat near the far wall, slightly darker than the others. It looked no different otherwise. I did not plan to step on it, but the warning lingered in my mind. What would happen if I did? Would the floor collapse? Would something crawl out? Superstition. That was all. I lay down and listened to the wind. Outside, the trees swayed. The house creaked. Sleep came quickly. Sometime later, I woke. I did not know why at first. Then I heard it. Faint rustling. Not the wind. Not a rat. Something moving just beyond the wall. I sat up. The room was dim. The candle nearly burned out. The sound was soft, like fabric dragging over wood. Then a whisper. "You found me." The voice was close, right next to me. I turned my head, heart hammering. The tatami mat. I could see it now more clearly than before. It was not darker. It was damp. A wet stain spread from its center, dark and glistening. The edges curled slightly. The rustling grew louder. A shift beneath the mat. Then a breath. Slow, deliberate. Inhale, exhale. I did not move. I did not blink. The candle sputtered, and for a moment, the room was black. When the light returned, the mat had lifted, just slightly. Something pushed against it from below. A hand. The fingers were thin, pale, pressing through the woven surface as if the mat were mere silk. Nails scraped lightly against the fibers. I grabbed my sword. The fingers curled. The mat lifted more. A sliver of darkness yawned beneath. I saw hair, long and dripping, spilling onto the floor. The whisper came again, softer now, almost pleased. "You found me." I stood. My mind screamed to run, but my body was rigid. The mat trembled. The thing beneath it shifted. A low, wet sound, like lips smacking together. Then the mat began to slide. I slashed. The tip of my blade struck the mat and drove into the floor beneath. Silence. The candle flickered. The room was still. I did not breathe. Slowly, I stepped back. The mat lay flat once more. The whisper did not return. At dawn, I opened the door. The woman was waiting, kneeling in the hall, as if she had been there all night. I did not speak. I only gestured for her to look. She stepped inside, eyes on the floor. Then she inhaled sharply. The mat was gone. In its place, a hole. The wood around it was rotten, blackened with age. It smelled of damp earth and something else. Something foul. She closed her eyes. "It has chosen you," she said. I gripped my sword. "What do you mean?" She only bowed. "You must go." There was nothing else to be done. I gathered my things. As I stepped out, the wind shifted. A faint whisper rose from the empty room. "You found me." I did not look back. I never returned. But sometimes, when I sleep, I dream of Tatami. of a whisper beneath the floor. And when I wake for a moment too long, I do not move. For I am certain if I do, something beneath me will move too. I was on the road for 3 days when the storm came. The sky had been dark since afternoon, thick clouds rolling in like ink bleeding across rice paper. When the first raindrops hit my shoulders, I knew I wouldn't make it to the next village before nightfall. The road was nothing but dirt and stones, winding through the mountains, and I had seen no inns, no houses, only trees. Then I saw the shrine. It was tucked between the trees, half hidden by the undergrowth. The wood was old, blackened with age, but the torii gate still stood, its faded vermilion frame just visible in the dim light. A single lantern hung from the eaves, flickering weakly against the wind. I hesitated. Shrines, especially forgotten ones, were not places to spend the night. There were stories, spirits that lingered, things that did not like to be disturbed. But the rain was picking up, and the path ahead was steep and slick with mud. I stepped under the roof. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the faint scent of burnt incense. Wooden pillars leaned at odd angles, the tatami mats frayed at the edges. At the back of the shrine, past an altar covered in wilted offerings, sat a man, a monk. He was thin, no skeletal. His robes hung loose on his frame, and his skin was dry, stretched tight over his bones. He sat cross-legged, hands pressed together, lips moving silently. His eyes were wide, unfocused, staring at the lantern. Cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said. "May I stay here until the storm passes?" The monk did not answer. The rain pounded against the roof. Wind rattled the wooden beams. I stepped closer, shaking water from my sleeves. The lantern swayed, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. "Sir," I tried again. "Do you live here?" Still nothing. I followed his gaze to the lantern. The flame inside barely moved, though the wind was strong. The paper was old, browned with age, yet it did not tear. The more I looked at it, the stranger it seemed, too still, too bright. The monk's whisper broke the silence. "Don't blow it out." His voice was raw, barely more than breath. He didn't look at me. His hands trembled, still pressed together in prayer. I frowned. I wasn't going to. He swallowed hard. His throat bobbed, skin stretched thin over his bones. "You mustn't." The wind howled outside. The rain showed no sign of stopping. I sighed, removed my wet cloak, and sat across from him. "It's just a lantern," I said. His breath hitched. "No," he murmured. "It's not. I should have left then." The wind did not touch the lantern. It burned without smoke, without flicker, as if untouched by time. I sat in silence, watching the monk chant under his breath. His eyes never left the flame. The storm outside roared louder. The wooden frame of the shrine groaned. Then I heard it, a whisper, thin as a reed in the wind. At first, I thought it was the monk, but his lips still moved in silent prayer. The sound came from the lantern, a voice too soft to understand. Something shifted in the darkness. The monk's breath quickened. His fingers curled tighter, pressing into his palms. Sweat glistened on his brow. I turned my head, scanning the room. Nothing. The offerings on the altar were undisturbed. The beams held firm despite the wind. Then movement, a shadow in the farthest corner. The flame barely wavered, but its light shifted, stretching long across the floor. The shadow twisted, its shape wrong, too tall, too thin. The monk's whisper grew urgent. "Do not listen." I did not move. The shadow shifted again. It was no trick of the lantern. Something was there. I should have left. The lantern pulsed. A flicker, brief but unmistakable. The air grew colder. The scent of old incense grew stronger, thick enough to choke. The shadow uncurled. A figure stepped forward. She was draped in something dark and tattered, hair hanging in damp strands over her face. Her limbs were too long, her fingers tapering into sharp points. She did not walk. She drifted. The monk's voice trembled. Stay in the light. I wanted to move, to run, but I couldn't. She hovered at the edge of the lantern's glow. The light cut across her face, revealing skin pulled tight over hollow cheeks. Her lips barely moved, but I heard it. You've come back. The air pressed against my chest. My pulse thundered in my ears. I had never been here before. The monk was shaking now, his whole body trembling with strain. She waits, he rasped. She remembers. The lantern flickered again. The shadows crept closer. Then darkness. The flame went out. I woke to silence. The rain had stopped. The wind was gone. Dawn light streamed through the open doors of the shrine. The monk was gone. So was the lantern. I sat up, breath unsteady. The floor beneath me was cold. My cloak was dry, though I remembered the rain soaking through it. I stepped outside. The torii gate was gone. The shrine was gone. Nothing remained but an overgrown clearing. And a single stone marker. The name carved into it was mine. The engraving was old. The edges of the kanji had worn down with time. The stone was cracked, moss creeping along its surface. I ran my fingers over the name. My name. Wind stirred the leaves. A whisper soft as breath. You've come back. I did not stay to hear more. I never found the path I had walked the night before. The village I had been searching for was 3 days away in the opposite direction. I do not know where I was that night, but sometimes, when I sleep, I dream of a lantern's glow, a thin whisper, a figure at the edge of the light, waiting. I never believed in ghosts. I'd heard the stories, of course, whispered warnings about restless spirits and vengeful yokai, but they were just that, stories. Things that old people told children to keep them from wandering alone at night. Then I met her. It was late autumn in Kyoto, kind of evening where the air smelled like burning leaves and the red maples looked like they were on fire. I had just finished work at a small publishing office near Karasuma and was walking home through the quieter streets of Gion. The tourist crowds had thinned, leaving the old wooden machiya houses standing dark and quiet under the streetlights. I wasn't thinking about much, just the usual, what I'd eat for dinner, whether I should finally buy a new futon, if my boss had noticed I left 10 minutes early. The kind of small, unimportant thoughts that fill the empty spaces in your head. Then I saw her. She stood under the dim glow of a street lamp, dressed in a pale blue kimono with a silver obi. The fabric shimmered faintly, like moonlight on water. Her posture was straight, poised, like the Geiko and Maiko who sometimes passed through these streets. But there was something off. She was too still, too quiet. She turned toward me, and though her face was hidden by a delicate white veil, I felt her watching me. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Do you know the way to Kayamizadera?" Her voice was calm, too calm. Most tourists asking for directions fumbled through their words, uncertain. But hers was smooth, practiced. I hesitated. The temple wasn't far, maybe a 15-minute walk uphill. But something about her, her stillness, the way her voice carried through the empty street, made me uneasy. I forced a smile. Just keep going straight and turn left at the next main road. You'll see the signs." She didn't move. "Could you walk with me?" she asked. "It's easy to get lost at night." Her voice was pleasant, almost too pleasant. For some reason, my mouth went dry. I wanted to leave, politely decline, bow, and keep walking. But my body didn't move. She took a step forward. The soft rustle of silk against stone sent a chill up my spine. "Please," she said, "just for a little while." She lifted a pale, delicate hand and touched the edge of her veil. My stomach twisted. I don't know why, but I knew what was underneath that veil, and I didn't want to see it. I took a step back. "I'm sorry, but The veil slipped. There was nothing. There's no eyes. No nose either, and no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretching across where a face should be. A horrible silence filled the street. Then, she took another step forward. I ran. I don't remember how I got home. I just remember the cold air burning my lungs, the uneven sound of my footsteps, the way the streets seemed to twist and stretch like a maze. When I finally slammed my door shut behind me, I stood there in the dark, gasping, my hands shaking. For a long time, I didn't move. I didn't turn on the lights. I just stood there waiting, listening. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no knock on the door, no voice asking for directions. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a trick of the light. A mask, maybe. A prank. I went to bed and forced myself to forget. Years passed. I never spoke about that night. What would I even say? That I'd seen a ghost? That a faceless woman had asked me to walk with her? No one would believe me. Life went on. I moved to Tokyo, got married, had a daughter. The memory of that night faded, pushed into the back of my mind, stored away like an old book gathering dust. Then, one summer, I visited my parents in Kyoto. My father had been sorting through old family belongings and had found an album of black and white photographs. Most were ordinary wedding portraits, family gatherings, formal pose shots taken at a studio. He flipped through them one by one, reminiscing. Then he paused. "Haven't seen this one in a long time," he murmured. He turned the album toward me. It was an old family portrait taken sometime in the Meiji period. A group of my ancestors sat in formal kimono, their faces serious. And behind them, standing slightly apart from the rest, was a woman in a pale blue kimono with a silver obi. Her face was smooth, blank. My father chuckled. "Strange, isn't it? Must be a problem with the film. I don't remember hearing about anyone like that in the family." Couldn't breathe. I knew that kimono. I knew that posture. And I knew that she wasn't just in the photograph. She had been watching me that night, waiting. I closed the album. "I need some air," I muttered. I stepped outside, into the quiet summer evening. The cicadas droned in the trees. The air smelled like damp earth and old wood. Somewhere, in the distance, a woman's voice drifted through the night. "Excuse me," it whispered. I didn't turn around. I walked, and I didn't stop walking until I was sure I was alone.